Hello, am I on time?
You're good. We're going to start in 2 seconds.
Great, thank you.
All right, let's go ahead and get started, y'all. Thanks for hopping on. Um, Happy Thursday. Today is opening day at the Texas Rangers ballpark, so hence the reason I have my jersey on. So go Rangers, beat the Red Sox. Um, Today I'm going to go through an hour's worth of discussion on the law of agency. I'm going to take you way back to real estate school. Some of this will be familiar to you. Some of this will be, oh my gosh, how did I miss that? I never knew that. And in exchange for all that, you're going to get an hour of free CE. So if you want CE, go ahead and just type the letters CE in the chat so I know to give it to you. And then similarly, if you want the credit, your camera has to be on and all that good stuff. But otherwise, it is free today. So, all right. So let's go ahead and get started. If you're not muted, go ahead and just make sure you're muted. But if you want to ask a question, go ahead and unmute and I will try and answer it to the best of my ability. All right. So the law of agency is one of 6 qualifying education courses in the state of Texas that you have to take to be a realtor. And It's a 30-hour course. So I'm going to do 1 hour of it. Certainly not an exhaustive explanation on what we have to learn, but I figured I picked out some of the key things that people tend to forget so that we're not out there just winging it. Um, so let's dive right in. So agency defined. So agency exists when one person, which is the agent, acts on behalf of another person, known as the principal, and they're also known as the client. All right. And so you could probably add in there in exchange for compensation. So some states are not agency states. New Mexico is one of them. You can't, well, you're discouraged from actually being a fiduciary slash creating the agency relationship. You're merely a transactional broker. All right. But in the state of Texas, um, we have that agency relationship, and all of this is commemorated in writing, which we'll get to in a second. Um, but this relationship is one of fiduciary. So it is based on trust, whereby we put the client's needs above our own. And that trust goes both ways, by the way. All right. So the agent principal relationship is what they call special agency. And special agency is what exists when um, the principal is only allowing the agent to do specific things, right, with regards to that transaction. In other words, the opposite would be general agency or universal agency, where a client might want you to sign documents for them and just have a broader scope of uh, responsibility. All right. But so special agency in the world of real estate is the most defined and specific relationship there is. And for 99.9% of your transactions, that's what you'll be doing. All right. So you may remember this acronym from real estate school. So, um, as a realtor, what do we owe our client? Now, this is everything today is national stuff. It is not Texas specific. Um, so this goes for whatever state you're in. So you might remember the acronym OLD CAR, and the O stands for obedience. So we owe obedience to our clients to perform whatever they ask us to within the confines of the law and ethics. So one example might be you might think that when you go to list a home, the list price should be 350 and the seller says, no, I want to list it for 400. Absent of taking a pass on taking the listing, you would list it at whatever the seller wants you to list it at. Okay. If um, the seller asked you to discriminate and only show the home to a certain demographic, that is not an example of obedience. We can't do that. That's against fair housing laws. Um, so just two examples there. Loyalty. So we pick a side and we represent it, right? So if we're representing a buyer, we owe them loyalty just to that one side. Right? We don't divulge information that would put them at a disadvantage. The D stands for disclosure. So disclosure of our relationship to others, um, disclosure based on material facts about the property are a couple of examples. The C stands for confidentiality. So we owe confidentiality to all of our clients if a buyer says that I just got a new job transfer and I know that you showed me all these homes, but I've got to take this one because I've got to be moved in by a certain time. Do we tell that to the seller? No. Similarly, if the seller is selling based on a horrible life event, death, divorce, whatever, that is not to be divulged to anybody. Accounting of funds. So this is not as prevalent today as it used to be, but this would be just a general accounting of all of your clients' money if by chance they deposited earnest money or option fee money to the brokerage. That doesn't happen a whole lot anymore, but that's kind of what that's about. Now, mind you, they are bound to deposit that with the title company, and it is our responsibility to um, guide them through that process where the title company accounts for their funds. All right, R, the last letter in the acronym, stands for reasonable care. So it might surprise you to know that this is one of the most common reasons for lawsuits and complaints from a client against their realtor because it's so gray and it's so overreaching that one person's interpretation of reasonable care might not be another person. So let's take the example of a listing. I think I've mentioned this story before, which is the reason why I don't really support making recommendations for vendors to people unless it's like a title company or a lender. But anything to do with the actual physical property of the home, you might want to think twice about because um, in West Texas and New Mexico, they have different kinds of roofs than they do here in the rest of the state of Texas. And there was a story that I heard. I didn't experience it personally, but where a listing agent listed a home, the some other agent brought a buyer. The buyer did an inspection, and the inspection revealed that the roof had to be redone. And when you have flat roofs, there's this material that goes across the top of it that doesn't go on everybody else's roof, right? And so the listing agent at the request of the seller, because the seller didn't know who to hire. She says, "Oh yeah, well, I've got a couple of people." Uh, the good news was she didn't recommend just one. She recommended three, and the seller um, got price quotes, and one roofer was kind of middle of the road. They had proof of insurance, they were bonded, and so on. There was another one that was the most expensive. They were also insured and bonded. And then there was the last one, which was the least expensive. And come to find out, they did not have any business liability insurance. That's who the seller chose. Well, the roof caught on fire through some weird accident and damaged the house severely. And the seller sued the agent along with the roofing company because, and won, because it was proven that the agent did not provide reasonable care to the seller when providing recommendations for a roofer. So whether or not we believe that she should have done her due diligence on making sure that that roofer had insurance is not a non-issue. What happened was it was proven that she did not provide reasonable care to her client. Another common one is, and this is why Trek is makes such a big deal about working in the geographical area that you live and are slash competent in. And so it's tempting to take a listing or even a buyer to a home an hour away or an hour and a half away, especially on the listing side. And you list that home and you're never going to go back there except to put the sign in the yard. We all know it. But the buyer goes in, house is vacant, let's say, buyer's agent goes in, uh, forgets to lock the door, and house gets robbed. Right now, is it our responsibility to go in every time someone shows a home? No, but um, the client could argue that why did you take a listing when you had to drive an hour and a half away, knowing darn well you couldn't check up on this vacant home, right? So you can kind of see where that gets a little gray. So old car. Now,
Brad, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
yeah,
I literally just heard a story about a home that was being sold, and a bunch of teenagers saw it on Zillow. They went in the home and threw a rave, like a party of over 200 people. And I mean, to your point, stuff like this is more common nowadays because we have so much more flexibility. And these kids, I mean, they caused damage of over $60,000 to the property.
yeah.
That's crazy. I mean, and if you're living far away, you're not gonna be able to see none of that. So
Yeah,
interesting.
and you know that what you're describing has happened to us before, several times because the house is vacant. Um, you know, and this all goes hand in hand with don't give out your super key. I know that's hard to do now because it's an app on the phone, but you know, don't give anybody your MLS code. I know it's easy and it's low-hanging fruit, but it just takes one bad actor. So good point. So these are the things that we owe our client, which is really all anybody ever talks about. What people don't talk about is don't the clients owe us things? And the answer is yes. And that acronym is CRIP, CRIP. And the C stands for compensation. So think about how we bind a client to the agency relationship. That's one of two ways if you want it to be enforceable. You either represent the seller through a listing agreement or a buyer through a buyer's representation agreement. And those two things are synonymous with our employment agreement. So it would stand to reason that they are signing something that binds them to paying us. right? So the C in CRIP is compensation. They owe us compensation. And even more so now after the NAR settlement, it's pretty clear um, in one of those documents. The R stands for reimbursement. And what this means is that you'll remember that in both of those documents, there are spaces for payment to you if you go above and beyond the normal paradigm of representing a buyer or representing a seller. And that could be things like um, you represent a buyer, buyer finds a home. He and his family aren't going to move in yet because they have to relocate from out of state, but they are going to pay you to hook up their utilities for them. And that might mean you having to put a deposit down or something monetarily. That's so they owe you reimbursement for that. Right now, they owe it to you because it's in the contract, FYI, right? This is not an oral thing. There's a spot in each of those documents for this. The more common example would be if you represented a seller. I've done this myself. And the house, quote unquote, needs a little work, needs a little TLC. Let's say there's some landscaping that needs to be done. Um, and they won't do it, or they're not going to do it on your timeline. You just want to get it done because you want to get the home listed. And so you do it. And you agree with the seller that they're going to reimburse you for the $500 it's going to take to get the landscaping done. All right. So if there's any money spent on their behalf from you that you're expecting reimbursement for, that's what the R stands for. The I, indemnification. So there are specific items and things in both the buyer's rep and the listing agreement that the buyer or seller will hold harmless us and you for those certain things. Now, we just talked about reasonable care, and anybody can sue anybody for anything, but there is very specific language in both those employment agreements that speak to, hey, basically it says if something happens and it's not the fault of the brokerage, you're going to hold us harmless. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff that is the fault of the agent or the brokerage, right? But for things that are not, such as, hey, everything's locked up, the house is vacant, the temperature went down to 10 for 5 days in a row, and my pipe bursts. I mean, that's on you, Mr. Owner, right? And then the P is performance. The client owes us what they said they were going to do. This is best exemplified through the seller, because in the state of Texas, there's not a whole lot of outs for the seller. So when someone raises their hand and wants you to list their home, there's no going back, right? Buyer example might be, I have a buyer's representation agreement for 6 months. We looked at 50 homes. They put in an offer on a home. So we did our job, and then they changed their mind on closing day. All right. So technically, you're owed compensation. You're owed the C and the P because you did your job. You're owed your payment, and they owe us closing. Okay. Any questions on old car or CRIP? All right, this is fun stuff, isn't it? So agency relationships in Texas, this is the only thing that I'll reference in the state. So the relationships in Texas that are recognized is seller, buyer, subagency, intermediary. Now, 3 out of the 4 are really the only ones that are practiced. I don't know why we still have documentation for subagency because it really doesn't exist, right? So before, 20, 30 years ago, as a result of a lawsuit, we all worked for the seller. whether we were bringing a buyer or not, we were all working for the seller because they were the ones that were paying us. Well, there was a lawsuit that where a buyer felt like they were getting shortchanged and wanted to be truly represented because there are two very different competing agendas. Am I right? So buyer wants the most amount of house for the least amount of money. The seller wants the most amount of money and to sell it quick. And so those two agendas sometimes don't jive. And this lawsuit resulted in buyer agency now, right? Before, if you brought a buyer, you were still working for the seller. And so that would be a sub-agency relationship. All right, so I'm not going to go into that today because it really doesn't exist. But I am going to go into the others. All right, so it has to be in writing to be enforceable. This is really mandatory now, but time was before the NAR settlement that a buyer's agent, before really entering into a written agreement, would act as a buyer's agent and take people out in hopes that they liked you and they would hire you. And some people didn't even get the buyer's rep signed, which is kind of why the whole NAR settlement thing happened. But these things have to be in writing. Now, you may have been led to believe that the only reason we have a buyer's representation agreement and a listing agreement is to get paid. That's only part of it. Really, the predominant reason we have these documents is the most important reason, which is until we have that agreement written, signed, and countersigned, I, as the agent, cannot give you advice. I can't tell you what your home might be worth. I can't do a CMA for you. I can't do anything that is not already public knowledge. So I don't know how many of y'all know that or realize that, but that is the real reason these documents exist. All right, that is the true definition of agency. It's not just to get paid. It's I'm with you, you're with me, and we're both our ride and die guys to the end, right? So let's talk about when we might wake up one day, or your client may wake up one day and not want to work with you. So if we believe that each of these agency documents should be in writing, well, like any good contract, there's got to be a way to get out of it, right? So let's review how they can be terminated. The one is when the purpose has been fulfilled, right? So your buyer's representation agreement signed for 6 months. They found a home within 3. You got paid. It closed. We're done. Our relationship ends. So that's the preferred way. It could end based on the expiration date of either document. All right. And that's pretty black and white when it comes to the listing agreement. That's why there's expired listings. But I'll review this later. But each of these documents has to have a beginning and end date to be valid. Okay. If it does not, then you don't have a contract. And so you've been practicing real estate without a binding contract, and good luck getting paid because someone out there will hold it against you. All right. So when the contract expires, at the time of mutual agreement, which means that, I thought this was going to be a good relationship, but you're going to go lease a house. You hired me and we've looked at 40 homes and you haven't picked one already. This is not good for my mental health. I got to get out. Right. And they could feel the same way. So if you both agree, that's another reason. I'm going to review the document for that, by the way. Death or incapacity of either party. Right. So death is pretty easy to define. Now, death of the agent. Okay. Yeah, death of the agent does not null the contract because a buyer's rep and a listing agreement belongs to who? Broker, right? So it would survive the death of an agent, not the death of the actual principal. Incapacity, uh, client or broker could have gotten in a horrible car accident. They are, you know, in a coma, and it is unknown when they're going to be back to normal. That would be another reason. Condemnation or destruction of the property, pretty self-explanatory. If it's uninhabitable, can't live in it, or it's been destroyed. Bankruptcy of either party. Operation of law. So if there's some legal precedent that dictates that the contract can't continue, that's what that would be. If the broker's license got revoked, so if the broker did something so egregious that their license got revoked or suspended, that would mean literally every agent under that broker is inactive. Abandonment by agent. So this is a big deal. This is probably one that you have not heard of before or realized that you can exercise. It's more for the client than the agent. On a scale of 1 to 10, in your humble experience, how easy is it to get a hold of another agent? Scale of 1 to 10. 1. Yeah, yeah. Ariana, what say you? Scale of 1 to 10. 0. Yeah, it's tough, right? So you all may not know, but in the state of Texas, there is a law, a new TREC rule that says that if you don't reply to your agent or client or someone involved in the transaction within 2 calendar days, that's no bueno. So, in conjunction with the incapacity example, let's say that that happened. Let's say that the agent got into a car accident. They don't remember anything. They're in a hospital and incapacitated. Their client's trying to get a hold of them to no avail. 2 days go by, heck, 2 weeks go by. That client is now within their right to terminate, whether they're a seller or a buyer, that agreement. Because in the eyes of TREC, that agent has abandoned their client. Okay, so please be mindful of that, because the more a client knows this, the more likely they're going to be to pull the trigger on this if you don't reply to them in a speedy fashion. And so why would that ever happen, you're probably thinking? Well, not a lot of people like to deliver bad news. All right, and they think that the problem is just going to go away if I just don't communicate. Lack of communication on behalf of a realtor is a client's number one complaint about our industry. All right, so if you're in an agency relationship, and let's say it's a seller, whether you're in a transaction or not, they are your client. So when you get into a transaction, it's either the stakes are even higher because now there's another agent, there's another buyer, there's title companies, lenders, and that's a whole other ball of wax. But if you're not communicating with your client, they can literally say, thanks, but no thanks. I don't owe you anything. You're treating me like garbage. You don't contact me, and I'm out. Okay, so just FYI. Revocation of the agreement at any time by the principal. So in other words, if the buyer or seller wishes to just get out, they can do that. And then termination at any time by the broker. I had an agent one time that just had a string of bad luck. For whatever reason, he kept taking coincidence. He was a very good agent, but he kept taking listings where the seller would not want to honor his commitments. So one time it was couldn't close on time, so he didn't think that he should move the date. Another time it was repairs that he agreed to do and he just didn't do them. And he just said, well, I don't care what the buyer does, let him sue me. Well, okay, that's an open invitation for dysfunction. And I terminated the listing because theoretically, well, number one, as you can imagine, it created a lot of risk for me personally as the broker. Um, but uh, but number two, in the listing agreement, it says he has to honor certain things. And you just can't wake up one morning as the seller and decide I'm not going to sell to this person, right? So it was obvious there was a disconnect between how we should approach doing business, and I terminated the listing. So this is why when like some of you, uh, you'll need to cancel a listing because either the seller wants to take it off the market to do repairs or they just want to take a break. You'll realize that you can't do that in the MLS. Only the broker can do that. This is one of the reasons why, right? Because all that stuff technically belongs to the broker. Okay, so there's only one thing that survives termination of a listing agreement or a buyer's representation agreement. The first person that can tell me what that is in the chat will get a $100 Chick-fil-A gift card. Now, there's a catch. You can only redeem it on a Sunday. All right, now if you can adhere to that stipulation, you'll get a $100 gift card to Chick-fil-A if you can tell me the right answer. It's I'll give you a hint. It's one of the letters in old car. So what survives either termination or just the closing in general? You can put it in the chat. It's either OLDCAR. Yes, Lisa, confidentiality. Correct. So it doesn't matter whether the home has sold or not. If the seller was going through a divorce, you're not to tell them even after closing or termination of the agreement. Termination is the most common um, ways that people think that they can break this. Uh, let's say you represent a seller and they are under duress and let's say the home doesn't sell, contract either expires or they terminate it with you. I'm just not ready to sell right now. And you have a buyer, they put the home back on the market with somebody else. You have a buyer and you now know information about that seller that's confidential. You're not to tell that buyer. All right, so confidentiality survives termination. All right, so seller agency. Let's talk about the different listings. So an open listing is more found in commercial because in the residential world, the MLS won't even let you put the same home on the market amongst different brokerages, right? But an open listing is technically where the owner gives the right to multiple brokers to sell the same property. All right, whoever gets there first and sells it gets paid. So you can kind of imagine with commercial assets being $1 million and up, why an owner might want to spread his resources around. All right. The other is exclusive agency. This is somewhat common and legal in Texas, and that's where the owner can bring a buyer, and if they bring it and you don't get paid. So this is somewhat common when the seller already knows that maybe their neighbor wants to buy it, and they have a pretty good sense that they're going to sell it to them. And if they do that because they've already procured that relationship, then you're not going to get paid. But just in case, I want to hire you because I need help with the contracts. Or if this does fall through, I want this to go on the MLS. That's very common. So just FYI, it's all about who gets paid, who brought the sale. Now, the most common and preferred method is exclusive right to sell, which means that if Mr. and Mrs. Seller chooses to sell it to their next door neighbor, too bad, they still have to pay you. Okay. And then a net listing, not too common, but the principle here is that, let's say an owner inherited a home, and from their deceased aunt, they barely know the aunt. They certainly have never lived in the home, and they just want to get rid of it. And they hire an agent and say, I know the home is paid off. It's clear of tax liens. I just want to get $100,000 for it. And if the agent can sell it for more, let's say 150, then the agent gets to keep the difference. All right, so there's no percentage commission necessarily. It's the net of what the owner wants and what the home sells for. Also legal in Texas, just not very common. So what constitutes a valid listing agreement? Signatures of all owners and the listing broker and the agent, right? So I have a general agency relationship with you all, which means that you are acting on behalf of me. So anywhere on any of these forms where it says broker signature, that's not me, that's you. You're an agent of the brokerage. Now, what does trip people up, and I got a lot of questions on this, is what if there's more than one person on the deed? You got to get the signatures of all the owners, right? What if it's a nasty divorce? They are not living in the home anymore together. One spouse is being real difficult. They both agreed to sell the home. You got to get signatures of everybody. Now, in that example, by the way, at least in Texas, even if there is only one of the spouse's names on the deed, now that they're married, you have to get both signatures. Okay, so be mindful that if you're entering into an agreement with a couple that's about to be divorced, there's a couple of more questions you need to ask them. All right, it's got to have a legal description of the property, including the street address. So there is always either a lot and block or meets and bounds description. There is always a parcel ID. And if it's not raw land, and sometimes even if it is, you will have a street address. You can't leave out the zip code. You can't leave out drive versus street. It's got to be complete. Okay, otherwise it opens up a door to say, well, I never bought 123 Main Drive. I bought 123 Main Street. And all of a sudden you got a lawsuit on your hands. And reasonable care. You're the buyer's agent. Should you have known that it was 123 Main Drive and not 123 Main Street? You betcha. That's all public knowledge. Reasonable care. All of a sudden you're being sued. List price of property as set by the seller. So a lot of times this is left open-ended because you want the listing agreement signed, but y'all haven't agreed on a price yet. That can't happen. All right, so that document has to be signed when the price has been determined. And then just as a refresher, this wasn't part of today, but if you want to change anything in that listing agreement, you've got to do an amendment to the listing agreement. So if the seller says 450 and 2 weeks later, you both agree it should be 425, there's got to be a paper trail. So you've got to do an amendment to the listing agreement. All right, as I mentioned earlier, got to have a definite start and end date. So sometimes in the world of commercial real estate, it can take years to get a deal done. You got to put a generous amount of time. Now, for a buyer and a seller in residential, we probably already know like the length of time that we should allow, maybe 4 to 6 months on each. given the market, but commercial's different. So you can't leave it blank. If the end date is approaching and you want to extend it, you can absolutely do that. But it's got to have a beginning and end date to be enforceable. All right. And then there's got to be an agreement to pay listing broker a specified commission. All right. That's the C in CRIP. They owe us. All right. Let's talk about disclosure. I always say if you're representing a seller, man, if there's any hesitation on what to disclose, I say disclose everything so that you worry about nothing moving forward. So as a refresher, you can't fill out the seller's disclosure for the client, but you can have a pretty robust conversation with them about how important this is and how this is their primary legal defense against someone coming back after they moved in and saying, you should have known this. Or how could this leak have been going on and you not know about this? How could you know the root system from that big live oak that's 3 feet from your foundation wasn't encroaching on your plumbing? Right? Now, common question I get is, what if it is an inheritance? Well, that's a bad example. That's excluded. What if you're working with an investor and they've never lived in the home? They're still bound to fill out the seller's disclosure. All right, there's only a handful of exemptions, and they're all legally based. It's selling to your spouse, it's result of an estate sale or an estate settlement, divorce, those types of things. Didn't live in the house is not an exemption. All right, and if I were you, I would have the seller's disclosure and the survey ready before you even list the home within the MLS. All right, if we see anything that is obviously defective and it's not disclosed, you can't take the listing because they're asking you to do something unethical. All right, so it doesn't take much to determine that that big, huge diagonal crack from the bottom of one window going up all the way to the top of the ceiling is a foundation issue. And if they try and brush it off, or another example might be if the roof leaked and they paint over the spots in the ceiling, that's complete deception, right? So we owe it to both parties, by the way, to disclose any material facts about the home, even if it is a disadvantage to our seller. Review listing agreement duties. That's a typo.
Brad,
Yeah.
I have a question. Well, it's on both sides. So for a buyer, I ran into just the other day, it was an investor who's they don't live around here, and they gave us a seller's disclosure. It was blank, but they signed it. So they didn't complete anything, but they signed it, and that's what they gave to us. I mean, I gave it to my clients. But is that if I were representing the seller that you would suggest, or they should complete the whole thing?
No, they have to complete it. I mean, it's not enough to just have it signed. And the reason is because in the version that I prefer to use, which is the Texas Realtors version, there is plenty of latitude to check unknown.
Yeah.
So I mean, there are ways to, if you're in that situation, to minimize your liability regarding how much knowledge you have about the home, but it's not enough to just sign it. So that document was not worth anything. They might as well not have given anything to you.
Gotcha. Okay, my second question is representing a seller, and you have your first seller's disclosure, and then you have an inspection or you find something out later. We should have them go back and do a new seller's disclosure and or add those things that are now found from the inspection report that maybe this is going from one, or okay, so this is updating the seller's disclosure, right? and if you're going back on market, or just to let them know what else was found. Like, are you supposed to, I guess supposed is the word, but is it best practice? Should you go and list those things are that you found from the inspection report?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts there. Number one is that as a result of the inspection report, if things pop up, they have to disclose those things. Now, mind you, they don't have to fix them,
Yeah.
but it's and look, shame on them if 50 things popped up that they didn't know about. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
this should be the expectation because they're going to
Yeah.
find stuff, but um, it's at that point that you figure out how much deferred maintenance there really is on this particular home. I mean, if a homeowner kept up with their home, you're not going to have much. But if things do pop up, they are obligated to disclose those things. Whether or not they fix it is up to them. But if it was, one of the biggies, roof foundation, HVAC, plumbing, electrical hot water heater, I mean, either fix it now or fix it later. The other issue is that um, if they have an inspection report that is, I can't remember, is it 4 years, at least 4 years recent, they have to give it to, upon asking, to another agent. So if a buyer comes forward and does an inspection report and the seller gets it and the buyer backs out because there's too much stuff, well, then now the seller has it and another buyer can come forward and ask for that and receive it. All right. All right.
Brad,
Yeah, go ahead.
but thank you. No, I was just wanting to say thank you.
Okay.
I couldn't find the button. Thank
Yep. Awesome. All right. So let's talk about buyer agency. So here we have the buyer representation agreements. There are now two of them. I'm going to pop them up in a second. And let's just review real quickly the NAR settlement rules for showing homes and open houses. So last August, when all this stuff kind of came down, there was lots of talk and lots of training done about what forms you use for what. Basically, there's a short form and a long form. The short form is one page and it's designed to create agency, but maybe with someone who hasn't fully decided to hire you full time just yet, or whatever. It does have compensation in there. But the long form is much more robust. It clearly indicates that you're working together. All right. Hey, Victor, go ahead with your question. You have to unmute.
Can you
You
hear
have
me?
a question, Victor?
Yes. Can you hear
Okay.
me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is, how long after you receive, let's say that in the case that you just talked about, the seller disclosure has to be updated because the inspection report came up with something else.
Yeah.
And then the seller decides not to put those things on the new seller disclosure. Now the new buyer comes in and buys the house. They did not disclose that. How long does this buyer have to refute or put a lawsuit against that seller before it comes new? What is the period that there is to be able to come up with a lawsuit against them?
Don't quote me, but I think it's 2 years.
Okay.
I'll get the exact number and get back to you. But it's either 2 or 4 years. I can't remember which.
Thank you.
Okay. So the buyer's rep agreement. So remember, when it comes to open houses, if you are hosting a home for one of our listings, you don't need to get any of the attendees to sign a buyer's rep. If you are hosting an open house for another agent slash brokerage, you do. And my recommendation is always just to have a stack of short forms there for people to sign. I wouldn't, I mean, I'm not going to say don't enforce it, but I wouldn't kick them out if they don't sign it. Um, you can't make anybody sign anything, but we need to be mindful to fulfill our obligation as a result of this settlement. All right. So let me just pop these open real quick. Okay, so I'll just finish up these 2 points, then I'll review some of these forms. So working with builders, remember that, I mean, I, I have yet to hear where a builder, as a result of the NAR settlement, is doing anything differently on commissions. Now, a lot of times their commission agreements will be rolled into the buyer contract. So I've had questions about, do I need the compensation agreement between broker form if I'm working with a builder? You do if it's not included in the buyer's contract, but 99% of the time, what you're going to get paid is in there. All right, so no need for that. If your buyer's rep says that your buyer is going to pay you 3% and the builder's offering 4%, you've got to get your buyer's rep amended to account for the 4%. Okay. Now, what if either party doesn't want to work with each other anymore? What form? So we all know about how to cancel a listing agreement, or at least we should. So it's called the termination of listing. But there is a similar form for a buyer. And some of you are going to say, oh my gosh, where has this been all my life? I've been working with this guy driving me crazy. I want to get out of this relationship. Help me. So there is a termination of buyer tenant representation agreement. It's a one-pager. It's TXR 1503. All right. So if you ever forget the number, just type in the word termination. It'll pop up. And I mean, you can read this. It's going to terminate at 11:59 on whatever date. And then, based on the relationship, you decide whether or not you're owed money. Usually it's going to be hard to collect on that. Usually these are done because the relationship went sour. So now if you're entitled to some reimbursement for something that you've done for them, that's another story. But it's going to be rare you're going to be collecting on a commission for a service that you didn't complete. But sometimes it's worth it just to get rid of this client. So a lot of people have forgotten that there's a document like this that exists. So here it is. The other thing is here is the buyer's representation agreement, long form. All right, it's 5 pages long, updated August 23rd of 24. And this is where all the broker compensation is. Okay. And then I mentioned before, additional compensation. You're hooking up the electrical services form, whatever. You can put in whatever you want there. All right, so this is the long form. And that's 5 pages long. And here's the short form. This is 1 page long. All right, so in your mind's eye, picture yourself hosting an open house for a Century 21 agent. All right, so not our brokerage. You're going to have a stack of these to have people sign, and you're gonna put in, who we are. Leave the client blank. Term begins this day. The day of the open house ends the same day. Put broker compensation 0. So the reason is because we have to have something signed so that they can enter the home. All right, that's the new rule. So, but you don't have to charge them for it. All right, so that's how you would use that. Now, in another instance where, you might have met somebody at an open house and neither of you are sure that you want to work together, but you seem to kind of be hitting it off. You don't think it's appropriate for them to sign the long form yet because you don't know where this is going, but they want to go see homes and you want to be able to do that on the outside chance that they're going to want to work with you and pay you. Well, you might use this form to do that. Okay. And you would put the compensation here. Now, as I've mentioned before, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on how to use this form, but you could put a beginning and end date for a weekend, right? So if you want to just kind of, date each other for a weekend and see how this goes, you could do that. Just put the beginning date as the Friday, the end date is the Sunday, and if it doesn't work out, doesn't work out. Okay? So those are the two: buyer's rep, and then I mentioned the termination. Let's wrap up with intermediary. So what is intermediary? Well, regardless of what Texas tells you, it's synonymous with dual agency. And I go, oh my gosh, don't mention that phrase. We don't do that in Texas. Well, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's a duck, right? So we are and we are not representing both sides. All right. So the most common scenario is where you have a listing and you're representing your seller, and a buyer comes forward who is not represented but wants to be. All right. So good luck with that, because what he's about to enter into doesn't really check that box, but that's what it is. So what forms do I need to execute that relationship? You need the intermediary notice and a buyer's rep. So picture this scenario. You've already signed a listing agreement with your seller. And you have most likely checked the box that says the seller is going to allow intermediary, which means that someone from our brokerage can bring a buyer. Okay, that is what intermediary is. Doesn't necessarily mean the buyer is not represented, but it could mean that another agent of ours is bringing the buyer. So that paperwork's been buttoned down. But let's say an unrepresented buyer does come forward and they want, more representation than they're getting now, which is none. The only way you can do that is to be an intermediary. Well, then by default, you need a buyer's rep, and they need to check the box that they're okay with an intermediary relationship. Okay, so don't misunderstand that if someone comes forward and they want to be represented, you need a buyer's rep still, even though now it's an intermediary relationship. All right. So what if that same scenario exists and the buyer doesn't want to be unrepresented? Okay, aside from jumping for joy, you really don't need anything. You're not an intermediary because you're not doing anything for that. You're representing the seller still. Now, will you end up writing the contracts? You betcha. Might you want to consider charging your seller more for that just to keep everybody out of Trek jail? Probably. But the good news about this scenario is that you still 100% fiduciarily, if that's a word, represent your seller. You are under no obligation to give any advice, nor should you, to the buyer. They've chosen to be unrepresented. So I'm just trying to distinguish between someone that's unrepresented and wants representation through intermediary and someone that, hey, they might be an investor. They've done this a couple of hundred times. I don't need you. I got it. Just draft up the contract. I'll sign it. I don't want any advice. All right. So what is that process? I've pretty much gone through it. So the buyer's rep needs to be signed for an unrepresented buyer. The checkbox needs to be checked on each of those employment agreements that you'll accept intermediary. But then, oh, by the way, you're going to need them both to sign this. Okay, the employment agreements are just for the off chance that it might happen. This document says it's happening, and this is what I need to communicate to you. All right, and so the process then, now that you're in this, is that you're just the go-between. You don't provide advice. You don't provide guidance. No opinions, no nothing. Okay? So this always looks attractive because of the payment component. You know, agent thinks they're going to double side the transaction and get 6% or 8%, 7%, whatever, instead of 2 or 3. But the risk is that you literally don't represent either side. And so the risk of a client coming back and saying this wasn't fair is pretty high because they're going to feel abandoned because they kind of know what this should feel like. But the moment they ask for advice and you say, I can't give it to you, that's when trouble starts to happen. So I am always in favor of intermediary with appointments, which just simply means, and I know we're running out of time, which simply means if you represent a seller, you're the listing agent, and a buyer comes forward and they're not represented, but they want to be, tell me, and I will assign an agent to that transaction. Now, by definition, it's still an intermediary relationship. Who's the intermediary? I am. I am. Okay. But it's a lot cleaner. It's what they call an arm's length transaction now because both clients have fair representation. Now, I can't give advice or opinions or guidance. Now I'm the go-between. And the two agents collaborate and negotiate with each other. Right? But because it's in the same brokerage, by definition, that's an intermediary. Right? Now, because of that, even though it's by appointments and there's an agent on each side, that document still has to be signed. Okay. All right, that takes us to our hour. Any questions?
I do.
Yep.
What happens to the commission when there's a intermediary situation? Can if I'm going to refer or ask you to refer somebody in the office per se, can I say, okay, I want somebody to represent, but I want to split the commission by 1%, or does it have to, who assigns that commission? How much that other intermediary person is going to get?
Well, it would seem to me that your listing agreement would have spelled out if and how much your seller is going to pay a cooperative agent, because that's what they really are. So I don't know if that would be different than any other situation. However, as we now know, as a result of the NAR settlement, you, Victor, could have signed something with your seller that says, I'm going to give the buyer 3%, but we all know that it's dependent on the offer. If my agent that I appointed brings an offer that's 20% less than list price, you as the other agent have the right to say, my seller doesn't want to pay you 3%, it's going to be 2 because your offer is too weak. So it doesn't matter if they're another agent in the office or not. It'd be the same practice.
I got it. I got it. Thank you.
Yep. Who else? I saw another hand raised.
It was me, Brad.
Yep, go for it.
Circling back to the open houses, if you're holding, did you say with you're holding an open house open that the attendees that come in, they need to sign a buyer's rep? Is that right?
If it's an open house that's not ours. So if it's an open house for a listing that's not White Rock Realty, then yes.
Okay, but if it's ours and within our brokerage, we're fine.
Exactly. And it doesn't matter who in the brokerage hosts it.
Okay.
You don't need it.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
On the commission,
Yeah.
I just got something the other day, which was the first, everything's changing with the rules. But when I checked to see if the property was available and if there's what's the commission, the agent's response was write it in the offer and we'll see what it looks like. And I feel like that's probably waiting on the list price and like what you just said, waiting and seeing or whatever. So, I mean, we wrote it. I wrote it in for the 3%. They came back and said, yes. But that was the first time I think I looked at my phone and I was like, what do you mean write it in? Why don't you just tell me like what
Right.
it is? But things were so different. And so I guess if I'd have put in 2, she would have said maybe yes or something. But I did put in 3 and they said, okay with the offer. So I do feel like now we are having to play the numbers game.
And that's going to become more common because it's just easier. So instead of, last August and September, where the directive was, we'll text or call the other agent and ask if they're going to pay me commission and what that is, so I can put it in a compensation agreement between brokers. Now the 1-to-4 family has that built into paragraph 12. So put in what you want. Now, in that example, though, the seller is going to pay you directly versus other agent splitting your commission. But again, I don't get that. It's all the same bank account, but I just think that you're going to see that a lot more because it's easier,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. Then I had a question about the short form. Why doesn't it reference the seller being able to pay? That's a good question. Why it's not in there, I don't know. It's in the long form, that's for darn sure. But each of them, the common denominator is that it's the buyer's responsibility to pay the agent. So why that language isn't in the short form and it's in the long form, I don't know. I'll have to reread that. Sorry, I don't have a good answer for you.
Hey, I just wanted to respond to Monique. Monique, if an agent doesn't tell you what it is and tells you to put in the offer, you always ask for 3%. If they're not telling you something different, you always ask for 3%. Let them tell you something. Let the seller tell you something different.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I wanted to put 8%. So I'm always going to go up there. Yeah, 3 for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if they tell me, I don't want to have to redo the contract, but if they don't tell me and they give me that, I'm going in at 3.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yes. Thank you.
All right. Awesome. All right. Well, anything else I can answer for you? All right. Well, before we drop off, if you wanted CE credit, type the word CE in the chat, and I'll be sure to get all that to you. And hopefully you found today helpful. And I'm here whenever you need me. So just reach out if you have any questions. But good seeing y'all and enjoy the nice weather. And we'll see you next Thursday. Y'all take care.